The envelope was thick, the kind of weight that told you it wasn't a friendly note. Her name was printed neatly in the return address, but it wasn't her handwriting. It was the sterile font of a law office. Most people would have frozen, maybe even felt their pulse quicken. I didn't. My hand stayed steady as I slid a finger under the seal. The words inside weren't a surprise. They were a formality, a performance she believed she was directing. She thought she was making the first move, that this letter would tilt the ground beneath my feet. But my path had shifted months ago. Long before she put her signature on anything, mine had already been inked on the same kind of papers. I let the thought sit there. The quiet satisfaction of knowing the script she was acting out was one I had already rewritten. Every decision, every step had been measured. And there was a reason I hadn't told her, a reason I was willing to wait. That part she was about to learn in her own time. That my name's Daniel, and at 42, I'd built what most people would call a settled life. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized engineering firm, the kind of role where consistency mattered more than flair. My career had been steady for nearly 2 decades, with a reputation for delivering on time, staying within budget, and keeping clients confident. I owned a modest but comfortable home in the suburbs, the kind of place where neighbors wave when you drive by, and the grass stays trimmed more out of habit than pride. For 15 years, I'd been a husband. In the early days, our marriage was simple in the best possible way. We shared coffee every morning before work. Friday nights meant takeout and a movie. Birthdays, anniversaries, we never made a spectacle of them, but we marked them with genuine thought. It was a partnership built, I believed, on mutual respect. The last 2 years changed that in ways I didn't fully see at first. Conversations shortened. Plans were deferred, then quietly abandoned. She started keeping her phone closer, angled away when a message came in, walking into another room to answer. I didn't leap to suspicion. That's not who I am. I've never been the type to chase shadows or build stories without proof. Trust, to me, wasn't just about feelings. It was a principle, a line I didn't cross unless I was given reason. And for a long time, I held that line, even as the signs became harder to ignore. That happened on an ordinary weeknight, the kind that blurs into the next. From the hallway, a voice carried, measured, careful, every word clipped at the edges. Yes, Mark. No, he doesn't know yet. The name landed first. A tone followed. Too professional for a friend, too familiar for business. Silence settled after the call, but it wasn't the easy kind we used to share. Drawers closed softly. Footsteps moved with purpose, and the evening resumed as if nothing had been discussed. A question rose to the surface. Who is Mark, and why does he need secrecy to exist in my house? 2 days later, a stack of papers appeared on the edge of the home office desk. Not bills, not project files, legal templates. Marital estate overview. Proposed division. My name printed again and again in blank spaces waiting for signatures that hadn't been requested. The structure of the documents spoke louder than any confrontation could. No dramatic scene followed. Instead, memory did the sorting. The new credit card, she insisted, was for points. The separate savings account she opened to track personal expenses. A canceled couple's trip that never found a new date. At the time, each item had seemed small, almost reasonable. Together, they formed a ledger. A conversation from months earlier resurfaced. She'd asked how bonuses were dispersed this year, and whether they hit before or after the fiscal close. Casual questions then. Now they read like placeholders in a timeline someone else was writing. Information had been gathered while I was still speaking the language of trust. Another call came late on a Saturday. I'll email you the spreadsheet, Mark. Yes, the retirement accounts are in his name, but that can be negotiated. The phrasing wasn't angry or emotional. It was procedural. A checklist voice. The kind used when decisions are already made and you're just arranging the furniture around them. Past loyalty offered itself as a witness and then stepped aside. 15 years of ordinary kindnesses, split holidays, quiet compromises. None of it erased the pattern building in front of me. This wasn't a momentary lapse or a desperate attempt to fix what was broken. It was strategy, executed in soft tones and clean margins. Instead of asking for explanations, notes began to accumulate. Dates of calls, phrases that repeated, file, names glimpsed on a printer queue, draft _allocation _V3, narrative _considerations. That last one lingered. Narrative didn't mean truth. It meant presentation. Somewhere, a story was being drafted where I played a role I hadn't agreed to. Finances confirmed what the papers implied. Transfers in round numbers that matched the totals on a printed worksheet. Small withdrawals timed to payroll cycles. An automatic payment redirected to a card I'd never used. Each transaction was ordinary enough to slip past a casual glance, but together they traced intent. Identity came into focus as part of the stakes. Not just the cost of a house or the shape of a retirement account, but the quiet inventory of a life, reliability, private integrity, a version of myself that existed in our shared history. A legal split could divide property. It could also try to edit who I had been. Confusion, once useful as a cushion, gave way to clarity. The air hadn't changed by accident. It had been conditioned, rehearsed phrases, careful timing, documents drafted before conversations began. She believed surprise was leverage. She believed I was still living in the story, where we were working things out. Calm took the place of reaction. Trust had been a principle, and it still was. It just no longer applied to a process being run. In secret, there would be no shouting match, no midnight argument that ended with two people saying words they'd regret. Information would lead. Preparation would follow. The last thing I wrote in my notebook that week was simple. This is not about catching her. It's about not being caught by the version of me she is writing. The distinction mattered. If a narrative was being built, then mine would need to be finished first. Not in anger, but in ink. The instinct to confront her was immediate. To step into the doorway of the home office, point to the papers, and ask for an explanation she couldn't sidestep. But that would have been a gift to her timing, not mine. If she had already involved legal counsel, then every word I spoke from that moment forward would be logged somewhere, interpreted in a way that suited her plan. So I stayed silent, not out of fear, but out of calculation. The evening unfolded, as though I hadn't seen anything unusual. We talked about dinner, about a neighbor's new fence, about the weather cooling earlier than usual. The performance felt strange, but necessary. In private, I began keeping a precise record. The day and time I found the documents. The exact wording I'd overheard on her calls. Not just the facts, but the tone, the pauses, the points where her voice lowered. Her schedule shifts went in the log too. Late returns home that she attributed to traffic, lunches that now ran into the afternoon, errands that didn't quite match the receipts. The more I wrote down, the more I saw a structure forming. She wasn't improvising. She was following steps. That meant advice was guiding her. Advice I didn't yet understand. Someone had helped her map this out, and that someone wasn't going to account for my awareness. There was an odd calm in treating it like an audit rather than a betrayal. Emotion could wait. Information couldn't. Every detail I captured now was insurance for later. If she was writing a case against me, I would be building one she wouldn't see coming. And the first rule was simple. Don't tip off the other side that you're already playing. It started with the bank statements. Not the online summaries she could erase with a few keystrokes, But the archived PDF downloads I'd been quietly saving every month for years. In September, there was a $4,500 transfer out of our joint savings to an account I didn't recognize. The same week, a $2,300 withdrawal hit our checking, labeled only as transfer. On their own, they could have been explained away. Together, they matched, almost to the dollar, the figures I'd seen scrawled on the margin of those draft settlement papers. From there, I began looking at patterns. Every Friday, within an hour of her leaving for what she claimed were client dinners, a transfer appeared. Smaller amounts at first, $800, $1,200, then climbing. I wasn't just seeing spending. I was watching her create a war chest. A week into my digging, I called Dan, an old friend from college who worked at the county clerk's office. We hadn't spoken in months, but he owed me a favor from years back, and I trusted him to be discreet. Over the phone, I kept it simple. Can you tell me if there's been any legal filing, consultation, preliminary paperwork in my wife's name? The pause before he answered told me enough. 3 months ago. Family law consultation. No formal filing yet. Confirmation should have stung, but instead it sharpened my focus. This wasn't paranoia. It was a timeline. She had been setting the stage for a quarter of a year while still sitting across from me at dinner. 2 weeks later, the mistake that tied it all together landed in my lap. She'd left her laptop bag in the living room, unzipped with a stack of papers tucked between a novel and a cosmetic pouch. I didn't rummage. I didn't need to. The top sheet was an email printout, her lawyer's letterhead at the top, bullet points outlining optimal filing scenarios, public-facing narratives, and strategic positioning to ensure advantageous division of assets. The language was clinical, almost theatrical in its manipulation. One line burned itself into my memory. Filing first establishes control of the optics. Frame the petition to position client as the injured party. It wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about manufacturing a perception that would outlast the legal process. I sat there for an hour, reading each page like an instruction manual for my own removal. There were proposed talking points about my increasing work absences and withdrawal from household responsibilities. Claims that, if left unanswered, could become accepted truth in the eyes of anyone who mattered, friends, family, even business contacts. By the time I slid the papers back into her bag, the picture was complete. The withdrawals funded her transition. The consultation gave her the plan. The correspondence gave her the script. She wasn't just leaving. She was building a version of history where I played the villain and she played the wrong survivor. And now I knew every step of her choreography. The advantage she thought she had was gone, even if she didn't realize it yet. The game had shifted, not in noise or confrontation, but in quiet, absolute clarity. The day I decided to move was unremarkable on the surface. No argument, no visible tipping point, just a quiet appointment booked under my middle name at a law office across town. I didn't walk in looking for revenge. I walked in to reclaim control. My lawyer, a measured, unflappable man named Harris, listened without interruption as I laid out the timeline, the withdrawals, and the attorney correspondence she had left in plain sight. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're ahead of her," he said. "The mistake most people make is reacting. We'll act, and we'll do it in a way that leaves no room for games." Over the next 3 meetings, we drafted a divorce agreement that was difficult to twist. Assets were divided cleanly, percentages that matched state guidelines, and every clause was worded to prevent the interpretive flexibility her lawyer seemed so fond of. There was no attempt to strip her of what was fair, but equally no concessions she hadn't earned. The language was neutral, deliberate, The kind of document that reads like fact, not fiction. When Harris slid the final draft across the table, I read it twice before signing. My signature didn't feel like surrender. It felt like sealing. A door she hadn't even noticed was closing. The papers were filed quietly, marked for confidential handling, and held under seal until service was required. If she tried to file first, she would find the legal equivalent of an empty stage. Her planned entrance already taken. At the same time, I began securing what was mine. Retirement accounts were shifted into individual protections. A secondary account, previously dormant, became my active deposit location for salary and freelance payments. None of it was hidden. Every move was legal, transparent to anyone who looked, but it ensured no late-night transfer or emergency withdrawal could change the equation without my consent. Harris called it defensive structuring. I called it insurance. Not against loss of money, against loss of narrative. If she wanted to claim I was reckless or controlling, the record would contradict her. If she wanted to suggest abandonment, the timelines would tell a different story. By the time the last document was notarized, the board was set. She was still moving pawns, unaware that checkmate had been quietly prepared. There was no satisfaction in imagining her reaction, just the calm certainty that, when the moment came, her version of events wouldn't survive contact with the truth. And that, more than anything, was the point. The email from her attorney landed at 9:17 a.m. on a Wednesday. The subject line, "Initial Proposal for Settlement Discussion," was written with the kind of confidence that assumes the other side is starting from zero. The document attached was almost exactly what I had expected. A heavily tilted division of assets, framed under the pretense of fairness, with just enough legal polish to make it look reasonable to someone uninformed. Instead of reacting, I forwarded the email to Harris with a short note. "Send them our file. All of it." 10 minutes later, he replied with a single word, "Done." At 10:02 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed Harris's number, but when I picked up, it was his assistant, her voice carrying an edge of suppressed amusement. "They weren't expecting that," she said. Her counsel asked me to confirm the filing date twice. By 10:15, the confirmation call came through from her lawyer directly. His tone was polite, but a little too careful, as though he was suddenly aware the footing had shifted beneath him. "Mr. Callahan, we've received your already executed agreement. I understand this was filed last month?" "That's correct," I said evenly. "It reflects a fair division, in line with state statutes. Nothing hidden, nothing exaggerated." There was a pause long enough to hear the faint shuffle of papers on his desk. "I see. Well, I'll need to review this with my client." When I spoke to her that evening, the difference was immediate. The breezy authority she'd carried in our last few interactions had been replaced with a kind of measured caution. "So, you've already filed?" she asked, the question wrapped in a tone that tried to sound neutral but couldn't hide the undercurrent. "Yes," I said. "The agreement is balanced. It avoids unnecessary escalation." I kept my voice level, my words clipped to the essentials. "No jabs, no moral lectures." She tried to pivot. "My attorney thinks there might still be room for adjustments." "Adjustments to fairness?" I asked, not unkindly. "Because that's all the document contains. Fairness." There was another silence, not the kind that invites more talking, but the kind that signals a conversation's momentum has shifted. For months, she had been operating under the assumption that she controlled the clock, the sequence, the framing. Now, she was reacting to a reality already in place. By the following week, Harris told me her attorney had recommended we wrap this up quickly to avoid unnecessary complications. The same lawyer who had likely encouraged her to file first and set the narrative was now the one urging speed, not strategy. Through it all, I stayed within the boundaries I'd set from the beginning. No public drama, no theatrics. Just precision. I didn't need her to admit defeat. The shift in her tone told me everything. The quiet efficiency of the plan had done its job. The day the lawyers met wasn't a scene of raised voices or pounding fists on polished tables. It was measured exchanges, documented facts, and the unmistakable moment when the person across from you realizes the game they thought they were winning was already over. And in that silence, I understood something lasting. The most decisive victories are the ones that don't need to be announced. 3 months later, it was over. No courtroom scenes, no late-night emergency calls from lawyers, no sudden escalations. Just 2 signatures on paper and a stamped decree. The settlement matched my version word for word, the same terms I'd filed before she even knew I had a lawyer. No inflated demands, no petty reductions. Exactly what the law allowed, exactly what fairness looked like. Mutual friends were almost confused by how quickly it wrapped up. Over drinks or at neighborhood gatherings, a few would lean in and say, "You two handled it so." Civilly. I would just nod. They didn't need to know about the quiet weeks of documentation, the legal chess game that unfolded before any official conversation had even started. Let them believe it was simply 2 adults parting ways, with Grace. Her position had shifted entirely by the end. Whatever confidence she once had in controlling the narrative had evaporated. There was no grand story for her to tell where I was the villain. The records, the filings, and the sequence of events left no room for creative framing. She walked away with her share. Nothing more, nothing less. And I walked away with my dignity intact. The strange thing was, I didn't feel triumphant in the way people expect after a betrayal. There was no rush of revenge, no urge to celebrate someone else's loss. What I felt instead was a deep, steady calm. I had protected my position without compromising my principles. I had proven to myself, more than anyone, that patience and preparation will always outlast reckless ambition. In the months that followed, I carried that lesson into everything I did. I became deliberate about documenting agreements, about noticing early shifts in tone or behavior, about planning my moves before stepping into any conflict. Not out of paranoia, but out of respect for the value of foresight. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone facing betrayal, it's this: the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one in control. Sometimes the real power belongs to the person who says the least, moves the slowest, and refuses to be pulled into someone else's timeline. And if you've ever had to protect yourself from a betrayal like this, I'd like to hear your story. Because the more we share, the more we remind each other. Calm, informed action will always speak louder than the noise.